Okay, so this is like take 4. We've tried this a couple times already, but we're gonna kind of continue this on from the video that you did and the video that I did. We were talking about a lot of different technologies that perhaps a lot of people weren't even aware of, how they have been using technologies for probably close to 100 years. We believe a lot of it could be used to not only manipulate people, but to manipulate nature in general. And this is gonna tie into what we believe is happening in the world today with what they're doing with biology, chemistry, physics, the whole works. However, specifically, we wanted to really kind of start getting into some of the things that you've been working on in the last 2 to 3 years. Originally, we started looking into electricity and all that. I mean, well, you're an electrical engineer, so you've been doing this for a very long time, but it wasn't until we started getting sick that we started making the connection between our bodily autonomy and the environment and how electricity could be affecting us, and also manipulating what you call the mind space. So why don't you start wherever you want to start, and we'll take it from there and kind of compose this into a conversation-like type of video.
Yeah, all my work, pretty much all my work in the last few years anyway, at least to about the beginning of 2019, has been kind of geared around structured water. So I've been always fascinated by water. You know, you and I have been drinking structured water for probably 4 or 5 years now, right? It's had quite a profound impact for both of us. So it's always been a fascinating subject for me, but then come 2019, I kind of really started to kind of dial into that a little bit more and kind of try and understand a little bit more of the deep science behind it. But it was mostly inspired by a lot of the work that Masaru Emoto was doing, right? He was kind of making some connections on really the fundamental state of the mind and how that is connected to water. And there was a connection that he found, right? Because when the mind is kind of in a state of anger and fear and hatred and these types of conditions in the mind, the water would respond to that.
Yeah.
And on the same side, if you're, kind of more compassionate from the heart, the water would respond to that as well. And the differences were quite profound. In the state of love, what he looked at was the kind of the geometric structure of the water molecules kind of took on a very special form, a very special geometric form, right? And when water was kind of responding to different hate and different states of fear within the mind, the water molecules would kind of be all chaotic, all over the place. I think this is very important because with Emoto's work here, what he's showing us is that when we operate from this place of fear, anxiety, stress, anger, ignorance, because they all seem to be very intrinsically connected here, the water within inside our bodies seems to kind of take on this more chaotic form, which is kind of shown to the image to the right here. But when we operate from love and compassion, it's almost like we can actually retune ourselves back to, I would say, almost like the true source of information that resides right inside the space. And this actually may happen through the water element. And we're going to be building on this idea as this video continues, because I think this hexagonal crystal geometry here that you're seeing to the left, in my opinion, and all my work seems to reflect this, is that this almost behaves like essentially a universal information container right inside the space. Now, Emoto's work has really caught my attention here because his work is really centered around the nature of information here. And when water seems to behave chaotically like this, it seems to come from this state of ignorance and fear within the mind. This tells me that there's essentially a lack of information, a lack of universal information that is essentially present within the water inside the body. And because water seems to occupy about 75% of the body inside of us. So this is very important. So water, I think, plays a very important role in how all the cells in the body seem to communicate with each other. And when we're operating from this level of fear, there seems to be a lack of information that's present within the water. And this is very important, I think, because the chaos that we're seeing here within water seems to almost behaves like noise does in electrical engineering. And in electrical engineering, really what noise is, it can be considered as essentially a disturbance to the useful information signal. And an example of this would be this, here's an example of a TV set here. where the TV itself is not actually tuned into any information. So it's just sitting there as just essentially static electrical noise on the screen. And this, I think we can make a connection here. And really, I think, in my opinion, we as humans almost seem to be acting like the source of this reactive noise disturbance here, which is another interesting way of looking at it, because we don't even seem to be conscious of this. And this might actually be what's truly disconnecting us from our true nature. And this is essentially the foundation of my theory, and it will be very important to remember this, this concept as this video continues. This was very fascinating to me, and I kind of really wanted to understand a little bit more about the mechanics behind this. So for me, on the beginning of that journey, I kind of quickly realized that the water molecule itself, it's fundamentally built by electricity, right? Because when you look at the chemistry of it, it's just made of hydrogen and oxygen, two kind of simple gases that come together and kind of form this kind of fluid-like substance, which is kind of really remarkable on how that happens. And then really those two entities are really just made up of protons and electrons. I mean, there's a neutron involved in that too, but I think that there's something much more deeper involved in what that represents, but we won't get into that right now. But it's just fundamentally protons and electrons. Now, I just kind of wanted to stop and pause here just for a few minutes, because I wanted to kind of talk about the actual structure of the atom itself. Because we've always been kind of led to believe in the past that really the structure of the atom is kind of built by really three key entities. And these entities are called the electron, the proton, and the neutron. And this is a really important subject to talk about here, because really, if we go back to the science of chemistry, we can see that really all the elements on this table, it's really just a play of these three key particles here. And what we also know about this periodic table is that everything that we see and experience in the physical world seems to be kind of built from this periodic table of the elements. So it's really important that we have an accurate model of what it is that we're dealing with here. Now, we've also been told that really these three key particles, they could not be further divided into something that would be considered to be more fundamental. Now, this has always been true up until maybe just a few decades ago. Things have kind of changed a little bit in kind of how we view the atomic nucleus, which is essentially where the protons and the neutrons are stored. Now, in the science of particle physics, we actually currently believe there's a more fundamental particle that's responsible for simulating the proton and the neutron within the atomic nucleus. And this particle is actually what's called a quark. And you can see here in this image, you can see within the atom, within the atomic nucleus, there is a particle called a quark. And you can see that the proton and the neutron are actually made of up and down quarks. It's kind of a unique combination of that. And what's really important to see about this is that this particular quark model, they're all built by essentially electric charge. All quarks are essentially built by, or actually fractions of electric charge, but electric charge seems to be fundamental in really the existence of a quark. And if you look below that, you can see there's actually a geometric model for this quark. And actually, if you look at the geometry of it, it looks like a hexagonal type of crystal lattice. And this is very significant to me with a lot of the work that I'm doing here. And really, this model, it's based on symmetry. There's a specific symmetry group that kind of corresponds to that, but we're not going to get too much into that in this video. But this quark model that we've come up with, it's obviously produced results.
in particle physics. There's no question about that. So I'm not questioning essentially the validity of that. But what I've found with the research that I've done is that this particular quark model, it only seems to have a mathematical existence, essentially. And this is really important to me because when we look at the quark, essentially when it's, if we look at it being built by electric charge. Now when we continue on in this video, you're going to see that I actually have a completely new model that shows essentially where electric charge is naturally concentrated within space. And I think that's what this quark model seems to be lacking, because from what I can see, this quark model really has absolutely no existence in space. It just seems to exist mathematically, and the equations seem to work themselves out, and this seems to be a good piece that fits into our puzzle. The water itself is electric, and then the mind itself is connected to that electric nature of water. So that tells me that it's almost like there's a bigger electric circuit happening here that we can't quite see. It's like the mind is almost the source of the electricity, the source of that electric circuit. And this is a new way to look at electricity, and this is kind of really the foundation of all my work, is that the mind is the source of electricity. And now when you say that, that probably should be raising some bells and whistles going off within you, to realize that you're a little bit more powerful, you're a little bit more, there's something within you that's much deeper that we need to uncover here, right?
Right. Because I guess if you look at it like we're thinking, you know, I actually been just seeing a few things online the other day, or today actually, where, you know, a lot of these scientists are treating the body like it's a machine in a lot of ways, saying it's a computer. And they're realizing there's these various different circuits and whatnot. And what you're saying is that the mind space is essentially electric. So it is that whatever's created in this mind space is manifested into this particular reality.
Yeah. It's animating it.
Right. It's creating.
That's what animates this physical, mechanical type of world. It's animated from a non-physical dimension of space. 100%.
Right. But
that's 100% my theory right there.
Right. And so what they're potentially doing, though, is they're wanting to manipulate the way that nature works.
Yes.
Whereas you're trying to understand the basic foundations of how this reality and physical matter comes into fruition,
right,
as opposed to manipulating it. It's understanding it rather than manipulating it. And that's what we believe Tesla had discovered. And they didn't want that because they enjoy manipulating and controlling things ultimately. Or they maybe not. Maybe they think that they're doing the greater good for humanity by doing all this and not realizing that there's terrible things that can go wrong when you do that.
Yeah, but really fundamentally, really the work that I've done, and this is kind of where all the research has gone, with a lot of data to back this up too, by the way, which is that really that almost like a portal into the mind, or this mind space is what I call it. It's actually going inside the hydrogen element. It's inside the proton. You got to go inside it, right? It's like almost jumping down a black hole, right? We kind of talked about this before, which is kind of very lines up to another scientist by the name of Nazim Haramein. He actually states that a proton is a black hole. He's done a lot of work to show that. And my work kind of lines right up into that, where it's actually, that black hole takes you somewhere. And it takes you to a much deeper dimension of yourself that we're not really aware of, because our five senses just keep us trapped here in this physical movie screen that we're all kind of witnessing in our own unique way. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So it's like the five senses are just keeping us distracted from something much deeper about who we are. Mm-hmm. Right? So the work that I've done is kind of, we have to go inside the proton. And when we go inside the proton, we get into a dimension, a new dimension of space. And this dimension of space has really been eliminated from all of science.
And why do you think that is?
Because of what's possible here. And it also leads to a much bigger picture about who we are as human beings, right? So inside the proton, we get to a very special place within space that's not physical to our five senses. Our five senses can't get at this dimension of space. And it gets into this dimension, what I call it's called Akasha. This is another name for it. The beginning of it. This thing's deep. Mm-hmm. We're just scratching the surface of it here. But once we go inside the proton, we come to a very special dimension of space. And it's actually where all of the electric charge is concentrated, naturally. So now we're getting to a newer theory of electrical engineering. Because electrical engineering is all about the flow of electric charge, right? When we understand about how electricity is flowing through our wires and all the other little gadgets that we have here, it's all based on electric current. No electricity happens without electric current. An electric current is a flow of this electric charge. And what I'm suggesting here is that the source of this electric charge is not even physical. So it's actually impossible for electric current to be flowing inside these physical wires.
Now, there are two types of electrical current that actually exist in electrical engineering. Now, the first type is what's called a conduction current. Now, this is actually the flow of electric charge in a physical conductor, like a copper wire, for example. And this copper wire is surrounded by an insulating medium, so you don't get an electrical shock. Now, the second type of current is actually what's called a displacement current. Now, this is a very interesting one. This is actually the flow of an invisible electric flux field that happens within a dielectric insulating material. So there's the flow of this flux field that's happening within the insulator, not the conductor, like a conduction current. And an example of this would be how this very subtle electric current flows across the plates of a capacitor. Now, I am simply suggesting that the true nature of electric current is much deeper than our current understanding today, which I think might be created from piezoelectricity, which is simply the harmonic vibration of the universal dielectric mind-space structure.
Seeing this clearly. So, and that's one of the reasons why I've kind of left my profession back in 2019 and I've never gone back. Because I know that my science, which is electrical engineering, is fundamentally flawed and incomplete at the fundamental level. And that is by no accident. Right?
Right. Which is funny because...
We have to go back to a little bit of history. We have to go back 100 years ago because there was a lot of... Everything about our electrical science was moving towards this dimension of universal space, what I refer to in my writings. Right? Everything was leading to that. James Clerk Maxwell's work was all kind of based on that. He kind of had a theory about the speed of light being connected to really the dielectric permittivity and permeability of the space medium. These are electric properties. But he was saying that the speed of light was really involved, was centered into something universal, right? Then Einstein came along and took the speed of light and said, no, it's relativistic.
Okay.
So this is where we had the problem. Mm. We did that because another guy at the time too, Nikola Tesla, he was coming along and he was doing all of his work from in this place. He seemed to know exactly what was going on in here. He had a theory of electric current. He didn't even know all of it. He just knew it, right? And he was able to do all these things. He was able to invent all these things in his own mind, and they just kind of blew everybody away. And I think he had some fundamental theories about what was going on here, about how it gets into more of a kind of spiritual, religious kind of foundation, which 100% that's where it goes, but we're not going to get into that in this video. But I think that really started to kind of scare a lot of people about what the true power of what electricity is. And there was something much more fundamental involved in really where the source of electricity comes from. And in my opinion, it's divinely inspired, 100%.
In a nutshell, they kind of want to write that aspect of it out of science.
Right.
They're not only doing this in electrical sciences, but they've done it in biological sciences, like in chemistry. They've done it even in physics in a lot of ways. You've even said multiple times to me, even quantum physics is, in a way, even though it's based off a lot of mysticism in a way, they've also kind of written it off even there too. They're, because there's a lot of fundamental science, like underlying principles that they have no real conceptualization for, but yet they won't acknowledge it, right? Like you were saying, like nobody really understands the proton. Nobody really fundamentally understands gravity. Nobody really fundamentally understands the ether, but yet we just assume that these things exist or don't exist and carry on.
Yeah,
So
you mentioned quantum mechanics. I mean, quantum mechanics fundamentally is just, you could look at it as just quantum electrical engineering. That's all it is, because you're dealing with the electron. Right? The electron is believed to be this wave field in space, everywhere. Just everywhere that fills space, there's this electron waving around. Right? And we tried to kind of model that with quantum mechanics. But the fundamental issue that I have here is that this is, again, kind of the foundation of my work, is that I think we have that backwards. I think we have the proton entity, which is a very special dimension of space in my model. And what surrounds it, if you go back to chemistry, we always remember the proton and the neutron are in the nucleus of the atom, and this electron seems to be whizzing around in the background.
Right.
That seems to be the model
circulating around it, really, right?
But I think we're looking at that backwards. I think the electron itself and the electric charge, like I said, it's inside the proton, inside it. And what's actually circulating around it is the magnetic field. Now this changes everything, because this tells you that the magnetic field is actually coming from a central source within space that's truly universal. And that's what builds, I would say, the experience of the physical world. And in my model, the magnetic field is just nothing but information. That's what it is. It's changing dynamic wave field of information. And when you look at light, for example, what we know about light in physics, it's made up of the magnetic and the electric field. That's what light is. So this is just one big kind of light show here. It's all information. We're starting to realize that light is made of information. You were watching a video there the other day about light codes, right? Light codes are what are kind of activating people and what the DNA kind of responds to, right? Light is just information. And information is fundamental. It is fundamental. We're starting to realize that in physics, but we're coming up with our own way of how we interpret information, which is relativistic based. And that's where we kind of get into where this work is kind of leading to, at least over the last few months for me, is that how does it tie into kind of what's going on in the world today, right? Because we have this pandemic taking over the whole world right now.
Right.
We're all kind of dropping down to our knees to this virus entity that we don't even really know what it is.
Right.
We don't even know what a virus is, period. A lot of people are saying it's just information. Okay, then we kind of have to reevaluate that a little bit, because information, I'm suggesting, if my model is correct, information is universal. And anything that's truly universal, you can't isolate. You can't. I mean, you can't take, like you take a magnet, for example. A magnet has a magnetic field. You can see it coming out of the North and the South Pole. But if you take that magnet and break it in half, you're left with two magnets where the same magnetic field is coming out of it. Like the magnetism, that's because the magnetism itself is coming from somewhere universal, right? And when you push those two magnets together, like a North Pole and on a North Pole, you can feel a resistance. Or if you flip it and you put the North Pole and the South Pole, they want to just suck each other together. It's because there's a universal dimension of space right between there that's omnipresent everywhere in this entire universe that acts as the source of that magnetic field. And it's connected into the physical, which is a very strange way to look at it, because we have to kind of look at how does the mind connect into the physical, right? And it's done electrically. And I think it's done through electromagnetic induction. I think that's another topic that we don't understand either, but we'll leave that aside. But there's something, we're not seeing the big picture because we have an inaccurate model of space. That's the fundamental problem in all our science today, all of it.
Right.
It's because the space element, like we talked about, is considered the fifth element, right? And the fifth element, you could look at it as, it's the ether, that's another name. Akasha is another name. In the model that I have, they're both, I wouldn't say they're exactly the same, they are, but they're so subtle differences that we have to, that's why I just say let's just call it space. But ultimately that's the fifth element, right? And
Right.
we've eliminated that in science. And in my model, what that fifth element represents, it's the absolute source of all electric field energy. It's the source of all intelligence. It's the source of creativity. It's the source of happiness, the source of joy, the source of basically all the best things that the human mind can ever conceptualize. It comes from that.